I'd like to start out by talking a little bit about the brain in general, and we're going to obviously go into much more detail. But the human brain weighs about 3 pounds, which is 1.4 kilograms. If you were to pick it up, it'd be very difficult because it has the consistency of a very soft jello. So, in fact, when you see people picking up, say, a brain, it's usually a preserved brain, and that's much, much stiffer than an actual human brain, which is very soft. And we can talk later about things like sort of trauma and things like that can the brain can be subjected to. And one of the reasons why this happens so easily is because the brain is so fragile. And of course, here's a picture of a Halloween Jello brain. So that does give you sort of a rough idea. Jello would be sort of similar in consistency to a brain, although it might actually be slightly tougher than an actual brain. So the function of a brain depends on specialized cells called nerve cells. These are also called neurons. And here's a depiction of a neuron. You can see here that there's what's called a cell body. There'll be processes, and we'll talk about this more in detail later, but these would be dendrites. It has and so there'll be input coming into this neuron through the dendrites. There'll be output through a long process called an axon. So that's this process here. And the axon will have, at the very end, it may split a number of times, but then there'll be axon terminals, which are being shown here. And this is essentially the output end of a neuron. And so within the brain and within the nervous system, we have neurons. And these are really specialized for doing various things. They can do information processing. They can also send signals, which are electrical in nature, long distances within the brain and also within the body. So within the average human brain, you have about 86 billion neurons. That's a tremendous number of neurons. And these neurons are highly interconnected. And so this makes the human brain one of the most complex structures known to man. I'd like to next talk a little bit about the motivation for trying to understand the brain. Lately, there's just been a tremendous explosion in terms of scientific knowledge about the brain. And with that, there's a lot of interest in terms of news articles, videos, popular science, and so forth. So people are very interested in the brain. We now understand, for example, that cognitive functions and stuff occur in the brain. And so we'd like to understand the brain from a personal perspective. For example, you might want to think about how memories are formed. How do you lose memories over time? Why are some memories kept while others you just sort of fade away? What happens, for example, when a person falls in love? So, for example, here in this picture, you can see some neural imaging that's being done. And one is a person presumably thought that they're being asked to think about their mother. And so certain areas of the brain light up. And you'll notice that in someone who's, say, in the midst of romantic love, if they are asked to think about their romantic partner, then different areas of the brain light up. And so this is quite interesting. So it tells us that obviously we know this intuitively, that different forms of love are quite different, but we can now actually start to get at this scientifically also. And so that's another thing that's very interesting, right? Trying to understand what's going on in the brain, relating that back to our own lives, as well as trying to understand what's going on scientifically. You can also think about the fact that everyone has a different personality. There's some individuality. So what is it that makes one person like one thing and another person like another thing? So, for example, some people love to gamble. Others simply don't really get much of a thrill out of gambling at all. And so really, it's quite incredible because a number of years ago, it wasn't really possible to ask these questions and then actually get some answers in a scientific way. But now it actually is possible. And if anything, the pace of scientific discovery, new imaging methods, and so forth is accelerating. So we're going to get deeper and deeper into understanding really interesting topics. So, for example, just to give one idea, many years ago, there wasn't really that much study of emotion. There was study of fear, which of course is a form of emotion. Um, so, for example, psychologists looked at fear conditioning and so forth in animals, and so we did understand quite a bit about fear. But it really simply was much more difficult to look at, say, happiness or love and things like that. But now it's actually becoming possible to actually ask questions about the whole gamut of emotions. Um, and of course, there's an underlying reason also that's very important for society, which is that uh, there's a lot of medical reasons why we need to know more about the brain. So, for example, in the United States, almost half of adults, so 46.4%, will experience a mental illness during their lifetime. And in any given year, about 5% of adults, these are people 18 or older, they're going to experience some sort of mental illness. And a lot of these mental disorders actually occur or begin quite early. They may begin around age 14 for half of these people, and by age 24, maybe three-quarters of the people that will have some sort of mental illness will have experienced it by, say, age 24. In modern times, we understand that the brain is the control center for the body, and it's also the seat of thought and consciousness. And these are pretty much uncontested statements that I'm making. Um, Now, this wasn't always the case. If you go back to ancient times, people really didn't think of the brain as being all that important. Uh, there were some there was some inkling, even back in ancient Egyptian times, that perhaps the brain had something to do with thinking. But in general, I would say most people really didn't think that the brain was up to much. And why was this? Well, if you were to look at the brain of an animal, say that you'd say slaughtered, you wouldn't really notice much going on. You'd just see that it was this inert mass. It had this sort of strange appearance, but really nothing was going on with it. And so, but if you looked at other parts of the body, it was quite obvious that the heart was something that could move and so forth. The lungs were something that could expand and contract. And so people generally attributed things like emotion to the heart. And actually, you can feel this in yourself. If you're excited, you can feel your heartbeat increase. So the vigorousness with which the heart contracts increases, as well as the heart rate. And that's something you can feel quite easily. And so it was very common to think of the heart as being the seat of emotion and also consciousness. And that continues to this day in a sense. We give heart-shaped boxes for Valentine's Day. We say things like "You broke my heart," and so forth. And so, that's basically going back to the idea that the heart was uh, much considered to be much more important than the brain. A good example of how little respect people had for the brain in ancient times comes from the Egyptians. The brain was one of the few organs the ancient Egyptians did not try to preserve when they mummified their dead. What they would do is they would remove the brain carefully through the nose, get as much out of it as they could possibly. I think they would also inject some chemicals and so forth to try and get the rest out. Fairly difficult operation, but a lot of emphasis was on trying not to disfigure the face, as that was quite difficult. But they would essentially get the brain out, and they didn't preserve it; they would just throw it away. The ancient Egyptians believed that the heart was the center of a person's emotion and intelligence, and the heart was really considered so important that it was often preserved as well as the other organs. So, for example, here we can see these canopic jars that are used by ancient Egyptians during the mummification process to store and preserve the viscera of their owner for the afterlife. So the brain wasn't preserved. Um, and what they would do is they'd put the various viscera in these jars. And the heart was considered so important they'd actually sometimes take this preserved heart and then put it back into the body because they believed that the person would need it in the afterlife. So there's an interesting question that arises. If these ancient people didn't believe the brain was the seat of emotion and consciousness and so forth, what exactly did they think it did? Well, there were a lot of intelligent people way back in ancient times, and they did think a lot about this. So a good example would be the Greek philosopher Aristotle. He was a student of Plato, and he thought the heart, not the brain, was the seat of consciousness. And so the brain then served to radiate the heat generated by the heart. So the idea was that the heart was generating all this heat as it was working hard to generate emotion and thought and consciousness. And what do you do with all that excess heat? Well, you have to radiate it out of your body somehow. And so if you look at the brain, it does kind of have a little, it looks a little bit like a radiator in the sense that it has all these grooves in it. And so that was sort of the logical, at least one idea of what the brain was thought to do. Interestingly enough, actually, Aristotle's teacher, Plato, actually did believe that the brain was involved in thought. So it wasn't that all ancient people thought that consciousness and emotion were in the heart and that the brain was just this radiator. So there was a lot of dispute, but Aristotle was so important that his views, even though that Plato was very well respected, Aristotle's view on the brain really took hold, and that was really a fairly dominant thought that the brain was simply a radiator. And Aristotle thought about this a lot, and he did back it up with some reasoned thinking. So, for example, he saw that humans have relatively large brains, and the idea was that, well, humans are more rational, they're more complex than simpler animals, like say a cricket or something like that. And so that's why they have to have a relatively large brain to dissipate this heat generated by the heart. And then much simpler, smaller animals, sure, they would have a brain, but it wouldn't be need to be nearly as complex or as large.